Okay, there's a lot to talk about right now, and joining me is my very special guest, trial attorney Brad Micklin's with us here right now on Law&Crime. Good morning to you, Brad. Good to see you.
Good morning, Jesse. Good to see you, too.
Okay, so one of the unique aspects of this case is it's almost like the state gets another chance at prosecuting somebody who was maybe responsible for the death of Mr. Knight. Well, the reason I'm talking about this is because we covered the Demetrius Elder case. So if you're sitting in the state's position, and yes, I think they're different prosecutors in both cases, but what could they learn from the first trial that they might want to change their tactics moving forward in this trial? Because we can't forget that Demetrius Elder wasn't found guilty of manslaughter, but the lesser charge.
I think there's a lot that they can learn from doing this a second time. First is that they did something wrong because Elders wasn't convicted of murder. It was culpable negligence. But I think also, when I saw the Elders case and followed it through with Law&Crime, there were always a lot of questions that came up that didn't make sense, and we saw it a little bit, or at least I saw it in the prosecutor's statement just now, where she talks about the solo cup. And if you're hearing this for the first time, you think, oh, why is that important? And later, it still becomes a question that I never really had answered as to why it was such a big deal, or at least other witnesses making it such an important issue. I think it's being used to possibly cover or change an unfavorable fact.
Okay, well, let's do some comparisons. So we just played you the prosecution's opening statement in this trial. Let's see how that compares to the prosecution's opening statement in the Elder trial. Okay, now this is fun. We get to break this down, Brad. You see the prosecution from one side, you see the prosecution from the other. Now, again, their styles are different, clearly, but what do you see the similarities and the differences there? I mean, clearly they're talking about the same event, but would you say they're framing it in a different way?
Well, it seems very similar to me. So when I look at an opening argument, or actually anything about a trial attorney, I'm always very critical. So I'm looking more at the body language, their intonation, how natural they are, before I'm even listening to what they're saying. So I thought the second one was more natural, more involved, more emotionally charged with it. But they seem to be saying the same story because they both highlight the solo cup, I think, almost too much. And that's why I say it makes it a confusing issue as to why it's so important.
That solo cup becomes a huge issue. We learned yesterday from a detective that when they first went to the crime scene, they didn't find it, and then the next day they find it. So the idea was he holding a solo cup or a beer bottle. That's something the defense has to explore.
I think it's going to be a huge issue. And not only did they find the beer bottle, did they test it for DNA, did he have the solo cup, did he not have the solo cup? It's all going to go to who started the fight and how. Was he really defending himself, the defendant, for his life, or was he the aggressor and trying to attack him?
Yeah, and I guess from the prosecution's point of view, what is the difference between the two of them? I mean, it really matters in who was holding the knife, right? And the idea that maybe Elder was the greater aggressor than Baptista. In fact, in the Elder case, it seemed that he was trying to protect Baptista. So that's an interesting avenue to explore as well, right?
Yeah, I think the big issue with the solo cup and the beer bottle is because Florida is a stand your ground state, which means you can use deadly force if you're protecting yourself from serious injury. And I think whomever is the one who started this fight, if it was Baptista who started it, then he's not standing his ground, he's aggressive. If he was defending himself, then he might be exonerated.
You know what I really want to play, and we're going to play in a little bit, the testimony of Wendy Gimbalis, and that's the girlfriend of Knight. We're going to play that right after this break. We have a lot more to discuss. We'll be right back. It's down right now. I'm back here with trial attorney Brad Micklin. We talked about the prosecution, what they need to do differently moving forward. The defense, yes, they got in two different, we're talking about two different clients here, but the idea that the defense in Elder was able to get a jury to not convict him of the highest charge, but the lower charge of culpable negligence. Here, if you're sitting in the defense camp for Armando Baptista, you still want that not guilty verdict. You don't want even the lesser included. So what do they have to do differently after looking at what the defense did in Elder?
I think two things they need to do differently, and you see it in the opening arguments. One is that they have to establish that Baptista was the victim, that Mr. Knight was the aggressor. He was bigger, he was stronger, and that's why they needed to use a knife against him. And that's why you hear Baptista's attorney talking about his weight and, you know, that he felt he had what Baptista was thinking about having to defend himself, so he took his knife that he uses for work. So they're painting a picture that Mr. Knight was bigger, stronger, and aggressive. But also, and this may or may not be a good thing for the defendant, is the attorney says they didn't know each other. There was testimony in the Elder's case that there was some kind of revenge fight involved here. So it's going to be a big issue in this case.
But I really like what you were saying is the idea of you compare the two defendants, right? Baptista, seems like the smaller guy. And so if you're trying to compare it to that, the self-defense claim might make more sense. But really, we're going to play a little bit later Wendy Gimbalis. What do they really need to do to attack her credibility? And we'll play it a little bit later.
They need to show first that she's biased and obviously wants to vindicate her boyfriend, but also that maybe her recollection is just not consistent.
Yeah, and then we're going to play that in a minute. But when we come back, we have a very special report from our very own Colin Combacher about a weird development in the Georgia election. So stay tuned here on Law and Crime. Well, welcome back, everybody. So we are going to be live today in the Armando Baptista case out of Florida, but we really can't talk about this manslaughter case without talking about the Demetrius Elder case, because what we know is Demetrius Elder was the co-defendant of Mr. Baptista, and he too was charged with manslaughter, and this was all back in July. We covered this trial here on Law and Crime, but in case you missed it, you really need to see what the verdict was in the Elder case. So let's play that for you right now.
Verdict, please.
In the Circuit Court of the 17th Judicial Circuit in Fort Broward County, Florida, State of Florida, State of Florida versus Demetrius Elder, case number 14-10348, CF-10A, Judge Ernest Holrow. We, the jury, find as follows to the defendant, Demetrius Omega Elder. In this case, defendant is guilty of the lesser included crime of culpable negligence. So say we all, it's 27th day of AD 2018 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Broward County. Four-person Jared Bitch.
Please poll the jury.
Talk about why this happened. Joining me right now is trial attorney Brad Micklin. Brad, culpable negligence, different than manslaughter. What are we thinking, our viewers and all of us, about how that happened? You know, what is the jury saying by making that verdict?
I mean, I think it was clear. I was actually surprised that they charged him with murder because Knight died.
Manslaughter.
I meant manslaughter.
Right.
But anything egregious like that, because Knight died by the knife stabbing, and Elders didn't have the knife. So there's no way you could tie that to the cause of death. Even manslaughter would have to be something reckless or, complete disregard. I was surprised they went that far in the first place and tried the manslaughter case.
Were you surprised that it was a culpable negligence, or maybe they didn't go, with not guilty? I mean, I think people were surprised by that verdict, that, we never think about the lesser charge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it was a little surprising. I don't think when there's a death and a person on trial that the jury's quick to acquit.
Right.
So I think they had to find something, and because culpable negligence, I think, carries 1 year in prison, that it wasn't such an egregious charge and sentence that I think it was easy for the jury to conclude.
Yeah, and look, if you're sitting in the prosecution stance, you're sitting in the state, you want that guilty verdict, and you want it right now against Armando Baptista. So let's play a little bit more of their opening statement from court. I believe it was from 2 days ago, so let's play that for you right now. That was Officer Yamed Yema, and I know I read the message boards. You're welcome, trial watchers. Let's talk a little bit more, though, about the meat of the case right now, Brad. And one of the questions I got to ask you, because I haven't had a chance to speak to you about this, in these self-defense cases, we usually see, or a lot of the times we see, the defendant taking the stand. Do you think that's going to happen here?
I do. I think you almost have to take the stand. I mean, although it's the prosecution's burden to show that it wasn't self-defense, I think if you have a person who is dead, and there's talk about this Elders, but he's not going to be mentioned in the trial because of a pretrial ruling. So the jury's going to be left to wonder what exactly happened here. If Elders was involved, what did Baptista do or not do? And I think he almost has to testify.
What would be the worst thing for him to say when if he were to take the stand? Like, what would be the thing that we would all look out for and be like, uh-oh, he just fell into a trap?
Anything he says that makes him look like he was angry, he was out of control, or there was some other history to the case, because his attorney stood up and said there was no connection, they didn't know one another. So anything he says that's going to contradict what either his lawyer says, or that's going to make him look like he was more involved than just defending himself. Any kind of anger, any kind of upset, anything like that will actually hurt him severely.
Would you say these cases are difficult to prosecute in the sense these struggles, these fights that end up in the death with somebody because it's hard to know what was happening at what point, and the really only key eyewitness we have is the girlfriend of the victim. So obviously our first thing is questioning her credibility. It's not like we had a random third-party witness who's watching the whole thing unfold. So are these cases difficult to prosecute?
I don't think they're that difficult to prosecute because obviously you have a death and a body, so that it's not circumstantial. And then with a case like this, you have a weapon, and you have two individuals, and you have some history. So depending on how the witnesses perform, and I think that's what we're going to see when the girlfriend gets up, that's going to make or break a case like this.
Do you think it would be smart for the defense in their closing argument to say, hey, listen, if our client didn't defend himself, he'd be the one who ended up as the victim?
I don't know if that'd be a good move in this case because Knight didn't have a knife and Baptista did. And I don't think the jury's going to buy that he was protecting his life. He was protected maybe from injury, but not his life.
And that beer bottle, maybe a broken beer bottle, it's not even 100% definite, right? Okay, well, these are all interesting questions, all interesting ways to explore. We are going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we are going to play some really important testimony. And again, we will play, if you haven't seen it, the testimony from the girlfriend. So stay tuned here on Law and Crime. Okay, let's begin discussing Wendy Gembeles, and joining me right now is a very special guest. Trial attorney Brad Micklin is with us. Brad, good to see you again.
Thank you, too.
Let's talk a little bit about interviewing her. So before we actually play her testimony, it's important to know what officers did. She was the main eyewitness to this altercation. Interviewing her and speaking to her right after this happens, you have to imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, that is going to be very different, her words, right after this happens than how she's testifying years later today. Would you agree with that?
Probably. I mean, there's mixed opinions on it. Some people think that the more traumatic an event is, the better you recall it, and others think that your memory fades over time. I'm the latter. I think your memory fades over time. So what you're going to say when you're in sort of the heat of the moment is going to be very different. But don't forget that she should have been prepared to review her statements and by the prosecutor and the questions she's going to be asked. So she should know what's coming anyway.
If her testimony is different from what she initially told investigators or from her first interview or for what she even testified to in the Demetrius Elder case, should we be looking at this and saying, huh, she's hiding something, she's not credible, or is she just a human being?
Depends where the inconsistency is. Obviously, being a human being and having the death of your boyfriend is very traumatic, and she's going to have some motive to color her recollection. But that doesn't mean she's lying either. So I think we really have to listen to what the facts are and where the important ones are. And
Officer Yema was talking about closing out the crime scene. Is that so to say, hey, nobody could get to Wendy Gembeles? Is that what they're trying to get at there? That, hey, she was secured, the crime scene was secured, there was no outside influence? Is that what we're getting at there?
Well, part of it, I think, also to show that nothing was disturbed. So later, when there's testimony about the beer bottle and the Solo cup, they can claim that it was closed off, there's nobody coming in or out, so that the chain of evidence from the beginning to the end at trial wasn't tampered with in any way.
But we saw the testimony from a detective yesterday who said that when he first got there, he didn't see the Solo cup, and then the next day he sees the Solo cup. Have you ever heard of that before? Seeing a piece of evidence one day and not the other?
It's unusual and it hurts this kind of a case, but it's not surprising because when you're going there at first blush, you don't know what to focus on. And if there's a victim and many people, you're not looking at what's laying next to them. It's not going to be relevant to you at the time. It only becomes relevant later.
Yeah, you know, with this piece of testimony, it could be pretty bad for maybe the prosecution. But let's talk more about Wendy Gembeles. And we saw Detective Carl Schlosser. He was the one who actually interviewed her. And so let's play some of that testimony in case you missed it. Okay, so it should be noted that was the cross-examination of that witness. And I'm curious, Brad, how do you think they did on cross-examining him? Because they were trying to make some key points.
I think they did a good job, actually. When you sit and listen to people talk and recall a story, you don't think much about it. But when you hear an attorney cross-examine, the question carries an implication. So when he says, she didn't tell you this, it makes the jury think, well, then it didn't happen. And it will later make her look like she's changing her story from what it was there to what it is now.
Is that what that is? Or is it also, hey, did you not ask the right questions, or was she not forthcoming? I mean, really, are they trying to do two things here? Try to discredit this witness and also trying to discredit Wendy Gembeles, or is it maybe I'm looking too much into it?
I think you're looking too much into it. Rarely will a defense
Shocker.
attorney try to discredit a police officer. You know, they come in with what I call a cloak of credibility. So if you're trying to hammer in on a police officer in a case like this, where it's not the police officer on trial, it's going to make you look like you're just playing dirty tricks.
Do you think the prosecution would have a strong case without her testimony? For in other words, if there was no eyewitness and there was really, you didn't have anybody, but you have the fact that one man is dead and 2 people are charged, is that enough to have a successful prosecution, or does it really all hinge upon her testimony?
I think it all hinges on her testimony because we have the beyond reasonable doubt standard. If you were to sit in this forum and say, do you think he did it even without Wendy's testimony? It'd be easy for us to say, yes, we think he did it. But you can't say that we know beyond, or it's proven beyond a reasonable doubt to sentence him for murder, and that's where I think the witness is necessary.
Tell you what, we're going to play more. We're going to play her testimony in a little bit, but before we do that, there's always so much else happening in the country. So here's a special report about what else is trending in the country today. Okay, in about a minute, we're going to play you the testimony from yesterday where she talks about that exact moment. But again, we're going to compare these 2 pieces of testimony. But Brad, just looking at how she testified in the Elder case, did something stand out to you?
I think she was a good witness in the Elder case. I think, first of all, she looks very soft and gentle. Her recollection is very clear and accurate. And I think she paints a good picture without seeming like she's trying to convince of certain points, which I think we'll later see in this case, where she emphasizes things like the cup and things like that. But I think here she did a pretty good job.
And she has to explain the, how should I say, the certain behavior of Muhammad where if he was aggressive at certain points or he did touch the defendants in certain points, she's admitting that. And that becomes key in order to make her a reliable witness.
Yeah, I think her testimony, everything is going to make it key to whether she's reliable or not, because she is going to be the crucial piece to understanding what happened between these 2 people.
You think it's difficult for the defense to cross-examine her because the jury might be very sympathetic with her?
It can be, and that's the hardest thing, is you can't really hammer in this witness either, like I said before about a police officer. You have to be gentle. She's a victim too. But you also have a job to do, and you need to bring out where it's inconsistent or where the facts support your client over her testimony.
Was there anything in particular when you read about this case, and maybe hear from her, that seems odd from the behavior of the victim, or does it seem, you know, the idea of getting out of the car or the words that were exchanged, does something seem strange how this all occurred?
A lot of it seems strange to me, both with Elders and now. My understanding of the facts, and it's even hard to follow it sometimes, which suggests that there's a problem, but my understanding was the victim's car was the first car at the stop sign, and Baptista was behind him. So I don't even understand why they wouldn't just go. What happened because he honked his horn? Why did he get out of the car in the first place if they didn't know each other? Why did this stop sign incident turn into a murder?
And I guess what the defense really wants to say is, well, he was angry all night, right? He was angry that he couldn't get to the party. He didn't know where it was. He was frustrated because the more they can show that, the more they can show he was maybe the aggressor.
Right, but they said that he didn't know one another. They didn't know one another. The defense opening statement said that Baptista didn't know Knight at all. So it sounds just like they happened to be at a stop sign together. And I think that's going to hurt the defense later if it comes out that that wasn't necessarily the case.
Okay, so we just played Wendy Gembelis testifying in the Elder case back in July. Let's see how that compares to her testifying yesterday. All right, so let it be known that we never really get this here. We never get the testimony of one witness who we can compare to her testifying almost in the same kind of set of circumstances in a previous trial. This is a very unique set of circumstances we have where we can compare her testimony. So I'm going to ask you, her testifying yesterday compared to how she testified in July, what did you think?
I didn't like her testimony yesterday. I think she comes off incredible.
Really?
Yeah.
What in particular?
Well, if you want to get really deep, there's a science about how people's eyes move when they're either recalling something or creating something. And her testimony yesterday, when she was recalling something, she looks towards her ears or upward. Here, when she's recalling the incident, she's looking straight. So either she's extremely well prepared or she just knows the story that she's going to say.
And we can't say that it was, well, the first time she testified was years ago. You know, her recollection is, this was back in July.
Right.
So that's a big point. So what do you think happened?
I think she realized the mistakes that she made or was properly coached, which isn't improper as an attorney by the prosecutor, to clean up the errors or the omissions in her first testimony that led to the not guilty on manslaughter.
Now, we have the privilege of being able to compare this. The jury doesn't see this. The jury only sees her testifying right there. They didn't see her testifying back in the Elder case. She used certain phrases that were similar, and she used certain phrases that were different. I'm curious your perspective on that, in particular how she described the solo cup.
Well, I have a problem with the solo cup because I think that's a little trite. I think if the use of the same phrase could suggest it's true. That's why it comes the same way. If it comes in the same verbatim progress of words, then it's coached and it's created. And the solo cup is like the main issue that keeps coming up on all these.
Because it's a problem. Was he holding a beer bottle or a solo cup? And at the end of the day, are we even clear on that?
I don't think we will be clear, and I think the more they talk about the solo cup, the more they create a thought in the juror, at least in me, that maybe it was a beer bottle, and she keeps saying solo cup because she doesn't want us to know that.
So how, if you're sitting in the defense's chair and you're watching her testify, and you know you've studied how she testified in Elders, what are the points that you're going to make under cross-examination?
It depends, because I don't know how hard they want to really lay into her. They could either use one area of cross to suggest things like she was emotional, it happened fast, there was blood, and therefore her recollection isn't accurate. Or they could go in another direction and say, you were there, you care about your boyfriend, you have a reason and a motive to want this to be vindicated, and therefore you're actually creating the facts that you need.
Well, this is just a taste of the testimony here that we're going to play, because we are going to compare how she testified yesterday to back in July. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, a lot more of Wendy Gembelis. Okay, so just to clarify, we played you the testimony from Wendy Gembelis back in July, and that was just the testimony from yesterday and in the Armando Baptista trial. I'm back here with Brad Micklin. Brad, we saw her testify 2 different times about the same set of circumstances. Did you see similarities or differences in her testimony?
Well, I saw more differences, and I have so many problems with the way she testified. I mean, first, not to overdo this eye science, but in the first clip, she looks down a lot when she's recalling the fight, which is common when you're recalling something physical. In the new clip, she's looking up, which is more like recollection. The first one, which is closer to the death, she's calm and collected. And the second one, which is further away, she's crying.
What does that tell you?
Yeah, I hate to be disrespectful about a death, but time heals all wounds. So she would be likely more upset and distraught the first time going through this than the second time. Time has passed, and she's been prepared, she's been through it. So it's less likely she'd be crying now, and more likely she would have cried the first time.
Are you saying there's something odd in the way that she's behaving and in the way that she's testifying? Because again, what we can't forget, and again, we're just stating the facts here, is that we had 2 defendants, both charged with manslaughter. The first one was found not guilty of manslaughter, but of the lesser charge of culpable negligence. And now the co-defendant is facing the manslaughter charge. So I guess the question becomes, has she been coached or rehearsed to change her testimony in a way in order to get a different kind of result? I mean, that could be a very cynical way of looking at it, but we're speculating here.
Right. I don't know if she was coached to do it, but I think she is doing it. It may not even be conscious, but she's certainly so much more upset now, and she's laying it on heavier. Even the description about the fight in the first clip almost makes no sense. She describes it like, well, she gets out of her car and she walks up to him and says, hey, honey, let's go. But yet, in the middle of the seeing blood flies, she claims, she's going to grab his arm and say, hey, baby, let's go. It doesn't make any sense. Fights don't happen like that.
Yeah, and not to downplay, I mean, she is a victim in this as well, and she lost a loved one, and this is really must be extremely hard for her to testify. One of the interesting aspects, though, is her proximity to the altercation, right? She seemed to be right there, trying to almost break it up at some point, but she herself didn't seem to suffer any injuries.
Well, and the way she describes it doesn't even sound like it's a fight, because she says there's one's on top of the other. She walks up, and she said, or one of them says, hey, get your man out of there. And I think Wendy's going to testify that Baptista said, or one of them said, he's got a knife. But yet her recollection and involvement is so calm and nonchalant. It doesn't make any sense. You would never be that calm in the middle of this incident.
Well, it's interesting. I'll tell you that much. It's very interesting to analyze this, and we have a lot more to talk about. Again, we expect the live feed a little bit later on, but as you see, we have a lot more to recap. We'll be right back right after this. Okay, let's talk about this right now with Brad Micklin, because there's a lot to talk about here. First, can we compare if he was in fact holding a beer bottle? Does a knife match up with a beer bottle in terms of self-defense?
No, and if he was carrying the beer bottle, it would clearly show him being the aggressor, because there's the bottle smashed later, and at least in the closing argument, it sounds like it was used by somebody in this fight. So it's just another weapon, and it's unlikely. And it would also explain why he would carry it with him. If it was his drink, he might not want to leave it in the car because it would spill. Whereas a solo cup, you could rest in a cup holder and be standing.
And we know there's a constant back and forth about whether or not he was holding a solo cup or a beer bottle. How does the jury sort that out? I mean, they're having testimony from Wendy Gemblis who's saying it was a solo cup. I don't even think he drank beer. I remember we recalled her testifying about that. So how does the jury sort this out?
I don't know, because I'm having trouble sorting it out. I mean, from the closing or from the opening argument, it sounds like they're claiming that Knight came to Baptista's car and started hitting Baptista while he sat in the seat. But Wendy's testimony, I believe, was that Baptista got out of the car and approached Knight's car because they weren't moving from the stop sign. So it almost sounds like the opposite is being testified about this beer bottle. So I don't even know, and I think where it was found may be crucial.
The size discrepancy, we talked about it earlier in the program, Baptista versus Knight. Does that ever become a factor in a self-defense case? If you have a much larger individual who you're in an altercation with, you may be allowed to use a weapon to protect yourself, even if if he had a solo cup, didn't even have a beer bottle. The idea that he was much larger than him, does that justify the use of a deadly weapon in a self-defense case?
Not in and of itself. I mean, the statute allows one to use force to protect against any serious bodily injury, so anybody could be likely to commit that, to inflict violence on another. The fact that he was a much larger individual makes it more likely or more believable, but it doesn't in and of itself mean that you can use deadly force.
So in other words, if you have a guy who's 6'5" and there's a guy who's 5'2", much weaker, this guy's a professional wrestler, and then you have him, and he takes out a gun and shoots him, could he still claim self-defense if this 6'5" guy was unarmed?
Not without something more.
Really?
And it wouldn't need a lot, given the description that you're making. Some overt aggressive acts, some threat to safety. But to use deadly force, I still think needs even more than that. I think it needs a real reasonable person's belief that they were going to be harmed seriously.
Okay, so the beer bottle becomes a big issue. We're going to play the testimony of Officer Melanie Peluso, who's going to say, well, was there a beer bottle or not at the crime scene? Let's see. We all just saw the broken beer bottle. Brad, we see the broken beer bottle, but we're hearing from a witness, Wendy Gemblis, the star witness, that there was no broken beer bottle, that there was no beer bottle. So are we to believe that this mapped out crime scene that was, no one was supposed to get a hold of, someone went in there and planted a broken beer bottle? I mean, again, what is the jury supposed to believe here?
Well, at this point, nothing, because it's just a broken beer bottle. I mean, it could have been just there by happenstance. But the question is going to be if the testimony later reveals that one person is claiming the other or some other person had a beer bottle and used it as a weapon, then it's going to be very important. And I think there's some testimony that you might be showing later about whether there was DNA on the bottle, which would identify whose bottle it was. I just don't know if it was conclusive.
Is it also fair to say that, listen, Wendy may have seen certain aspects of the fight and not others, and maybe she just didn't see the beer bottle? And then the counter-argument that to be, well, she had so many really specific details about the fight, how could she not see it? I'm curious, is it possible that maybe she just didn't see it?
Well, it depends, I think, who was carrying it. If it was Baptista carrying it, she would have likely have seen it because they were at the party together, they were in the car together, he got out of the car and she watched him. If it was Knight who had it, then maybe not, because it would have been a shorter period of time that she would have seen it, and maybe not even at all.
Okay, and even if he had a broken beer bottle, I'm talking about Mr. Knight, even if he had a broken beer bottle, even if he was the one who got out of the car, and he was the one who started this, could you argue that the mere fact that the car that had Baptista and Elder in it, that it was stopped, and they didn't move, that was the first act of aggression?
It could be. That goes to the claim that there was like a revenge killing, and the party that they came from, if that ties it together, then yes, because I'm left with the question of why didn't the car just go? Why did they stop? And why did something so simple and routine become so tragic?
And for a jury, how difficult is it for them to say, and you mentioned it before, you know what, we have a man who's found, we have a guy who's on trial, we're not sure the specifics, but we know that someone is dead. We can't let this guy off the hook.
I agree, and I think the fact that he was carrying a knife, although he's going to claim it was for work, is going to hurt even more, because I carry a briefcase for work, but I don't take it out if I don't need it. I wouldn't carry a knife with me unless I thought I was going to need it. It doesn't matter that it was for work.
That's an interesting point. And again, we want an impartial jury, but at the same point, when you have somebody who's no longer with us and it was part of an altercation, you're trying to find out who's responsible. And clearly, like you said, we know that someone died and who was ultimately there. Listen, we'll take a quick break. When we come back, there is a lot more to discuss. So stay tuned here on Law and Crime. Okay, so what we learned from Lisa Cruz, this crime scene technician, is that there was blood and shards of glass found in Baptista's car. I'm back here with trial attorney Brad Micklin, who's covered a lot of different cases. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells us that the prosecutor's case and Wendy's testimony could be accurate. If it was in his seat, it's likely he was struck with a bottle. One thing I found myself wondering, though, is why the prosecutor wouldn't have brought it up in the opening statement, which I don't recall, because if you have that big of a weakness to your case, you try to negate it by trying to explain it away. You want to be the first one to do that, and I don't remember hearing anything about it. So it's really strange that such a crucial point has been so silent all this time.
I mean, they can't say there is no beer bottle when there's a beer bottle at the crime scene. We saw it. We saw a photo of it. And now you're hearing testimony of the shards of glass in the car. So if he was holding that beer bottle, though, if Muhammad Knight was holding that beer bottle, how much does that hurt the prosecution's case? Because, again, at the end of the day, he was stabbed. He's no longer with us. He died.
The fact that he was holding a beer bottle, I don't think is that traumatic of an issue for the prosecutor. It's what he did with it. If he was coming from a party, maybe he just brought his beer with him. But if he took it out as a weapon, or if he smashed it so that the base broke off and he could use it as a knife, that's an entirely different situation.
And we're not entirely sure how that happened.
Right, yeah.
But the idea is, does it really matter what was in the mind of Baptista if he's like, uh-oh, I see this beer bottle here. I don't know what he's going to do with it. I thought maybe it was broken, maybe it wasn't. Does that add to the defense's case?
Sure. I mean, if I see a large man coming at me with a beer bottle, I'm going to be worried. I mean, I'm sure he wasn't just nonchalantly strolling up to the car. I mean, there obviously was a heated situation, regardless of what may or may not have happened before. So any reasonable person being approached by a person with a bottle in his hand is going to be fearful.
And that's why you had said earlier it's even more important that he testifies to help explain some of this away. I'm talking about the defendant, of course. So actually, let's play now, because we want to compare this. This is the testimony of Wendy Gembelis, the girlfriend of Muhammad Knight, saying there's no beer bottle. Okay, I'm confused. Brad, are you confused? They're sitting on the jury. We're hearing this evidence about the beer bottle. We're seeing the evidence of the beer bottle. She says no beer bottle, that he didn't even like beer, that he drank vodka. If I'm sitting in the jury, what am I supposed to do here?
I think you're supposed to wait, because we don't know whether she's telling us the truth, whether it was, all we know is there was a beer bottle somewhere in the scene. We don't know if there was pieces in the victim's skin. We don't know how it got into one of the cars that we heard just a moment ago. But it's going to be, I think, almost a deciding factor, because it sounds like there's opposite views. She's saying there was no bottle, and the prosecutors and the defense is saying the bottle was the impetus to this whole fight.
Maybe, is it possible that both are right? That I think I might have heard a question about this, that is it possible he had the beer bottle in the solo cup, which I'm not really sure why that would be, but is it possible that maybe he was carrying both items and maybe she didn't see it?
Possible. It's unlikely, though.
Yeah.
It just doesn't not how people act.
But really the problem is, if we don't believe, if you're sitting on the jury and you question her credibility about the beer bottle, do you question her credibility about everything else, or is that a stretch?
No, I think you question the credibility. Not even if you don't question the credibility. I think it's of everything she said. It's still such a crucial point of, did somebody have a weapon or not? When you're talking about beyond a reasonable doubt, it's going to hurt the prosecution's case just because it's such an important fact that may be confusing to people.
And I mentioned earlier, I just want to get your perspective on it. This is why it's so important for Baptista to take the stand, right, to explain any of these inconsistencies.
Yes, because if we're sitting here confused and we have the benefit of taking our time to think about it, we're looking at the old testimony, and we're still confused by it. The jury must be baffled, and it has to be clarified by one of the sides of this case.
And then you're really comparing the testimony of a defendant to a witness who is a girlfriend of the victim. So it gets kind of complicated. And who do you believe? At the end of the day, there's two sides, and you have to find your version of what the truth is in the middle. That's why it's probably so hard to sit on a jury, especially in this kind of case.
Well, especially because they both have incentive or motive to fabricate. I mean, one's on trial for his life and one's trying to vindicate her boyfriend's, I don't know how serious it was, you know, their relationship. So they both have reason to color their statements. The defendant obviously has more, though.
Yeah. Well, here's what we're doing. We're talking about this testimony. We're waiting for the live feed in the courtroom a little bit later on. There's so much to talk about, clearly, in this case. And if you missed the testimony of Wendy Gembelis from yesterday, don't worry, because we're replaying it for you today. And especially in light of her testimony from July, and we're comparing those two pieces of testimony. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, as you can imagine, we have a lot more to talk about in this trial. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this with Brad. Brad, she made some interesting points about that crime scene. I'm curious what stood out from you.
Well, it's hard to say at this point because we didn't get the rest of it, but it shows the bottle's obviously very significant, but the defense is trying to indicate where it was in relationship to the car, whether there was blood on it, clearly going to showing the jury, I think, two things. One, that it wasn't Baptista who used it, and two, that they're not afraid of it. And I think that's more important when you have such a confusing issue, a confusing type of issue, to at least show the jury that it's not a concern of yours.
And she didn't observe the red Solo cup. Her job is to investigate a crime scene. She didn't see the Solo cup.
Yeah, it's shocking. And again, you would think that this witness would be prepared for that issue, and obviously they can't change their testimony in the recollection, but they're making this issue, the Solo cup, huge, and I think that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, well, let's see what happened when Wendy Gembelis was under cross-examination. And remember, she had claimed that Muhammad Knight, he didn't have a beer bottle in his hand, but a Solo cup. So let's see how she did under cross-examination about that fact. Okay, so when they first went to the scene, there was no Solo cup. They go back the next day, then they find the Solo cup. Brad, I mean, I've been saying Solo cup for the last 3 hours, but it's important. It's really important. Can you explain that, how it might show up strangely the next day?
It's hard to say because the cup is in favor of Mr. Knight to show that he was not the aggressor. But I can't imagine that Wendy would have had the forethought to go the next day and plant some kind of evidence. But it might explain why she first didn't say it to the police officer at the crime scene that night, and then later added it in. Maybe once she heard it was found, either it triggered a memory or it gave her some support to change the story to be favorable for her.
What we played before our last break was her saying how the cup was, like, thrown, and that became maybe, I don't know, that's why we couldn't find out exactly where it was. But it should be noted that that was redirect. It didn't even become a discussion under direct examination. So let's see how he did, this Detective Jonathan Zeller, under cross-examination. Again, if you haven't seen this from yesterday, you really should. Take a look.
Back to that neighborhood the next day?
The following day, yes.
What time?
It was daylight, so the afternoon.
It was the afternoon?
Right.
Okay. And so it's your testimony that you find a red Solo cup in the yard of the house on Miramar Parkway?
Yes. Right next to the driveway of that house, yes. Of that house that I pointed out before.
This house here?
Yes.
Here's the driveway?
Correct.
So it's in the grass, is it on this side, to the west or to the east of the driveway?
I'd have to look at the photograph again, but it's from that house now.
You'd have to look at the photograph of the picture of the Solo cup itself.
Correct.
Okay. How long? And this is grass here, right? The front yard is grass. That's the green we're seeing on the demonstrative aid.
Yes.
How far of a distance are we talking about from the stop sign to where you ultimately find the red Solo cup?
10, 15 feet. I'm guessing here. It's not 10, 15 feet, maybe.
Okay. All right. And the red Solo cup was photographed?
Yes.
It was collected?
Yes.
Was it ever tested for anything?
I believe it was sent for testing.
Okay. Do you, as you sit there now, have any idea where that red Solo cup came from prior to you picking it up?
No.
You were on the scene the night before, correct?
Yes.
And no red Solo cup was found the night before, correct?
Well, I wasn't looking at that particular area right there. And not to mention, it was also nighttime. So
Okay.
we prefer doing our canvases during the daytime to see better.
But the answer is no. No red Solo cup was found the night before, correct?
I didn't look at that particular location for that solo cup, no.
Okay. And there were other crime scene techs and other police officers out there as well the night before, correct?
Yes.
All right, I'm made of questions right now. Brad, first question, is the defense saying that this cup was maybe planted there?
I'm not sure what they're going to say. I mean, the simple solution is to find out whether there were fingerprints or DNA in it. It's a cup. Somebody was holding it. Somebody was drinking from it. If it's one of these parties, you would think, and I wasn't sure from this testimony, this clip, that they would have tested for both of those, fingerprints and DNA.
Yeah, but saying, like, do you have any idea where the cup came from before you found it, and why did you not find it the night before? Is it fair to say, hey, listen, it was nighttime, you don't see everything as easily as you could canvass a crime scene during the day? Is that fair?
It's possible, and a cup is very light. I don't know if it was windy that night. I mean, it's possible that it was planted for some reason. It's possible that it just blew out of the trees for some other reason.
Yeah, I mean, again, if I'm sitting on the jury, do I now have a question of, okay, was Wendy Gembalis being truthful, or Gembalis was being truthful, or is it the idea that the police might have been improper police work? I mean, what am I supposed to be thinking as I'm sitting there? Because the jury, you don't get to ask them questions every day about what's going on in their minds.
Yeah, I think the jury is just going to be confused because, again, my recollection of the opening arguments, which is what you would believe they're carrying with them through these witnesses, the only one who even talked about the beer bottle was the defense. So you would think it's in their mind that the beer bottle is very important to the defendant, and we're all confused about the solo cup.
And I guess if under closing arguments, that's how you try to explain it one way or another.
You would hope.
Hey, listen, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we have more to talk about in this trial, so stay tuned here on Law and Crime. Okay, so we're learning a little bit more of the dynamics and the relationships leading up to this fight that went wrong. Back here with Brad Micklin. Brad, so what did we learn from that opening statement about how this all unfolded?
Well, I think they're just starting now to give the jury the background. They're letting us know the witnesses like Corey, whose house was where the party was, and what happened before that led up to this incident, which is crucial because the jury has to have the background. They have to know whether or not it was a revenge murder or whether it's an accident. They have to know if what the defendant said in the opening argument, that they didn't know one another, is true or not. I also think, though, this prosecutor made a mistake by not starting with these witnesses first, because all they did by bringing in police officers create all these issues and confusion without giving us the background first, and that's what I think we're going to walk into now.
Interesting you should say that. In the first trial, I'm talking about the Demetrius Elder case, we saw Wendy Gembalis be one of the first witnesses to testify, and here it wasn't the case. Why do you think that is?
I think they're just trying a new strategy because it didn't seem to work on the Elder's case.
Yeah, and whatever they could learn from that trial, they'll move into this one. The idea of seeing these people and how they were all connected, and really the person that connected them, you could say in a way, was Corey McMeth, who threw this party. And if you haven't seen him testify in the Demetrius Elder case, we're going to play his testimony now, and I got to tell you, we always love to see very colorful and very interesting witnesses take the stand. This is a guy, what a personality. Take a look. This is great. I love this guy. So let's talk about this, Brad. You can answer his question. What does that have to do with the stabbing death of Muhammad? What were they trying to get at with this idea of Armando and Walter and this fight? What were they trying to get at here?
I think they're trying to get at that Muhammad had some altercation with, I think it was another person actually, or an issue with another person, and was going after Baptista and Elders because of it. And this is a crucial witness, I think, for the defense. And I think they made a huge mistake by allowing the prosecutor to even question the way that she did, because everything was a leading question and called for speculation, and there wasn't a single objection from the defense. And it really hurt his case, I think, a significant amount.
But what do you think the jury got from that? What do you think they're getting a better understanding of the relationship between the parties before this whole fight broke out? I mean, did they learn anything significant from this?
Well, I think they learned whether or not there was any history. I still don't think it ties together well with a murder. Even if there was a revenge issue in the past or a problem in the past, to turn it from a party and a problem in the past to murder at a stop sign is a stretch.
Final question to you. The fact that there is no relationship between them, does that hurt the prosecution's case or help it?
I think it hurts the prosecution's case because if there was no reason for them to be angry at one another and it erupted into murder, it's confusing because people just don't act like that. People don't just get out of their car, smash somebody with a beer bottle, or take a knife out of their pocket and stab them. So the jury needs to know why this would have happened.
Yeah. Brad Micklin, thanks for coming on and staying with us for such a long time. It was great having you. I want you to have a great weekend. Come back. We'll talk more about this case and other ones.
I will.
So here's what we're doing. We're waiting for the live feed in that courtroom. As soon as we have it, we'll make sure to go there. We're going to take a quick break. I will be signing off. Rachel Stockman will be signing in. And there is a lot more to discuss in the Armando Baptista trial. We'll be right back. Stay tuned here on Law and Crime.